Welcome everybody. I hope the sound is okay. Welcome to the Considerati Insight Lab series. My name is Ana Maria Corca. I'm Director of Regulatory Policy at Considerati and joined by my colleague Cornelia Kutter, Managing Director. As a legal and policy consultancy, Considerati brings expert-led sessions on today's most important legal and regulatory topic, such as neurotechnology. Our goal with this series is to provide practical, clear insights that help you navigate complex challenges in law, technology, compliance. So thank you very much for joining us as we explore the latest trends and try to find solutions together shaping the future. Today's topic, neurotechnology, encompasses devices, procedures that access, assess, or influence brain function. And these are rapidly advancing beyond just the hospital or clinical settings into consumer applications. As these technologies become more integrated with our daily life and into society, they raise profound and fundamental questions of autonomy, of human rights, and of privacy. In Europe, we've seen recent regulatory efforts, and to name a few, updates to the medical devices regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation, DI Act, the Data Union Strategy, that all aim to address these unique risks and opportunities and keep to innovation and these opportunities posed by neurotechnologies. However, the debate only is starting or it's continuing around how best to protect individuals' rights and ensure fair, ethical, safe use of brain data, especially as international discussions on neuro rights and global standards are just gaining momentum, I would say. So today's panel brings together really leading experts to explore these really pressing fundamental issues at the intersection of brain health, data governance, fundamental rights in the age of neurotechnology, I would say. This is the age we live in. Over to my colleague Cornelia.
So, as we look to the future of neurotechnology, and before I introduce our esteemed panelist, I'd like to highlight a newly published report by the European Commission's Joint Research Center entitled Emerging Applications of Neurotechnology and Their Implications for EU Governance. This timely study underscores how rapidly advancing neurotechnologies are poised to impact a wide range of policy areas, from healthcare and education to employment, security, and fundamental rights, while also raising urgent questions about data privacy, consumer protection, and the adequacy of the current regulatory frameworks. Before we begin, a quick note on housekeeping. We encourage an interactive discussion, but would like to ask for your patience until the end of the presentations. You can do so by raising your virtual hand or typing your questions in the chat. We'd appreciate if you would introduce yourself when you speak. Let's keep the conversation open and engaging for everyone. With this said, I would like to introduce our panelists. Professor Douglas Weber is the Akhtar and Buddha Professor of Mechanical Engineering, the Neuroscience Institute, and Biomedical Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, and a leading expert in sensory feedback neurotechnology, blending neuroscience and engineering to understand and enhance sensory, motor, and cognitive functions. His research has led to new therapies and devices for people with stroke, spinal cord injury, or limb loss, as well as wearable technologies for healthy individuals. Professor Weber was a founding member of the DARPA Biological Technologies Office and launched several major new technology programs and supporting the White House Brain Initiative under the Obama administration. Virginia McHugh leads the neurotechnology program at the Center for Future Generations in Brussels, focusing on regulatory, ethical, and legal aspects of emerging consumer neurotech devices. She holds a PhD in sensory neuroscience from the University of Sussex and a postgraduate certificate in EU policymaking. Previously, Virginia worked at the European Parliamentary Research Service, specializing in future literacy and science policy strategy. Her research spans responsible innovation, biotechnology, precision medicine, and health policy, driven by her passion for how technology and society shape one another. Last but not least, Dr. Susanna Del Signore is an expert in clinical trials and regulatory strategies for neuro devices with over 20 years of R&D experience in neurology. She has held senior roles in major pharmaceutical and biotech companies, including Chief Medical Officer, and worked at the European Medicine Agency evaluating treatments for neurodegenerative diseases. Professor Del Signore founded Blue Companion, a startup focused on e-health and innovative clinical methodologies. She has led international projects in clinical development and regulatory policy and has contributed to major public-private initiatives targeting age-related conditions. Professor Douglas Weber, over to you.
Thank you, Cornelia. Oh, no. My computer is asking me a permissions thing, open system settings. Oh, dear. I might have to leave the chat and reopen. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Apologies for that. It seems that there was a permissions settings issue. Let me try again. Okay. Are you able to see my slides?
Excellent, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your patience, and thanks for this opportunity to speak with all of you. So my goal really is to just provide a kind of a broad overview of the neurotechnology field. I'll be somewhat biased in this coverage because I'll focus primarily on those things I work most closely with, but I think they do provide a nice example of kind of the scope of interface technologies that are being developed and some of the applications that they're intended to support. So just to start, to give an overview of kind of our perspective on things, we try to take a balanced approach to developing technology that starts with an understanding of the nervous system and neurological function, so as to understand how processes work naturally, and then where there are deficits or challenges, such as after a stroke or a spinal cord injury, what tools can we engineer to try to intervene and modify or replace damaged function. So with that in mind, obviously the nervous system is this large network of nerves that span the entire body. Everyone tends to focus on the brain, but the spinal cord and peripheral nerves are obviously critical elements of that distributed network. We work on devices that both sense and stimulate activity kind of throughout the nervous system. I'll focus on two in this talk. One is a family of devices called brain-computer interfaces that are intended to communicate information directly from the brain to adjacent technologies. And then as well, we're also working on wearable sensors that measure not brain activity directly, but the myoelectric or the electrical signals generated in muscles associated with brain activity in the motor system. In addition to sensing, we're developing various technologies and targets to stimulate signaling in the nervous system to support, again, a range of functions from restoring sensation to an amputated limb, suppressing pain, enhancing or improving cognitive function, and as I'll illustrate towards the end of my talk, reanimate limbs that have become paralyzed because of stroke. In addition to the work that we do just within our laboratory at the university, we make it a point to work closely with companies that are developing relevant technologies in this space, so that our goal of creating not just knowledge, but new solutions for the community are met. I don't need to probably say more about my background. Cornelia mentioned this in my introduction. I do want to highlight some of the work that I did when I was at DARPA, because I do think it provides a nice example of the breadth of technologies that are possible with neural interface technology. So the first program that I developed was something we called haptics, which stands for hand, proprioception, and touch interfaces. And the challenge that we were trying to solve is how do we take a human-like prosthetic hand, a hand that mimics the form and function of a natural biological hand. How do we connect such a sophisticated device directly to the user so the user is able to operate that hand as if it were their native hand? And importantly, how do they feel the touch that would normally be experienced when you use your hand to grasp something like a cup of coffee or tea and the like? And our approach was to build electrodes and electronics that could be implanted in the body to communicate directly with the natural sensory and motor pathways of the arm to convey control signals out to the hand to make the hand move naturally as if it were the original hand, and as well to bring feedback from the hand to the nerves so the brain can sense when contact is made with objects. So that's something we called haptics. There's a lot of what we call neuroprosthetic technologies being developed to support a range of applications in the motor rehabilitation space. But in addition to the motor system, we realized that we could use a similar family of technologies, that is, devices that connect directly with nerves, to not only control motor function, but to control autonomic function as well. And so we developed the electrical prescriptions, or the electrics program, with the goal of sensing and modulating activity in the autonomic system to support development of new therapies for inflammatory diseases and even post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm happy to say that just last week, one of the teams that we funded about 8 years, well, almost 10 years ago in this program, just recently completed their first clinical trial of the technology they developed in this program. So, it was a bit of a moonshot 10 years ago, but it's already starting to show progress in the clinic. And then lastly, we developed the targeted neuroplasticity training program with the goal of modulating neural signaling in the body to accelerate the rate at which plasticity or learning occurs in the nervous system. So now I'll dig a little bit deeper into a couple of specific examples of technologies. And the first is really motivated by the need to provide people that have limited motor function or limited mobility the ability to interact more freely and effectively with digital devices. So for people with tetraplegia, which is often caused by upper level spinal cord injuries, it's very difficult to use computers, tablets, and other digital devices, which are now so very critical for almost all aspects of daily life. And so the loss of the ability to use your hands makes it very difficult to use traditional computing devices, because those are devices that rely on physical interaction or a mechanical interface. We push the button on a keyboard or a mouse, and we move the joystick on a gamepad controller to control our actions that are being performed on these devices. And so for people that lack the ability to generate that mechanical input, we're looking to neurotechnologies and more broadly bioelectronic interfaces that can measure motor intention signals from various parts of the nervous system, including the brain and muscles, and then communicate that information directly to the computer to enable that connection and communication. And so I'll just highlight two broad classes of work we're doing in this space. One is with implantable devices that measure signals from the brain, and the other is wearable myoelectric sensors. So just to start, this concept of a brain-computer interface, it's sort of a hot topic these days, given some highly visible players in the field like Elon Musk. The idea is that the brain is a hub for communication and processing of information. Motor functions are controlled directly by the motor cortex in the brain. And so if we can access signals from those motor areas of the brain using electrodes, we can interpret from those signals an action that a person is trying to perform, and then communicate those intended actions out to a broad class of assistive devices that can then execute or support those actions. And so now I'm just going to play a video. This video is almost 15 years old at this point, but it provides a really nice example of what's possible with this type of technology. So I'll just introduce this participant. Her name is Jan Sherman, and she has agreed to have her name shared. She is paralyzed from her neck down, so she cannot move any of the limbs in her body. She can't move her fingers. She can speak, as you'll hear, but Jan volunteered to be a participant in one of our studies of implanted brain-computer interfaces. And so we implanted electrode arrays in her primary motor cortex. And by measuring the signals in Jan's brain that are associated with the control of arm movement, Jan was able to learn how to control a prosthetic arm. So let me just show you the video.
5 months after the surgery,
Can you hear the audio?
She came back to see whether she would be able to control the robotic arm with nothing but her thoughts. They plugged her brain into the computer, and this is what we saw.
I can move it up and straight down, then left and right and diagonally. I can close it and open it, and I can go forward and back.
That is just the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Can we shake hands?
Sure.
No, really.
Yeah.
Come right over here?
Yes, you come over there.
Okay.
You grasp your hand there. There we go.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And I can do a fist bump if you'd like.
That's amazing.
So what I find amazing about that demonstration is really just how effortless it is for Jan to control this, fancy robotic arm as if it were a natural extension of her body. And the ability to do that is derived from two things. One is obviously the technology that allows us to sense signals directly from her brain, but it's also in large part due to our deep understanding of how signals in that part of the brain encode information about movement. And so this combination of neuroscience and engineering is critical to success in any of these areas. So now I'm just going to move on. So we, for many years, have relied on electrode arrays that look like this, that require surgical access to the brain surface to position the electrodes in the brain. Where there is a profound need, I think the justification for such a surgery is clear. But for many patients, this is likely to be a high barrier to adoption. And so as an alternative, we've been exploring less surgically intensive approaches to placing sensors inside the brain. And one such route of entry is the vascular system. And so there's a company called Synchron that has developed an electrode array that is positioned in the brain via the blood vessels. And I'll show you an animation. So this is the device. It looks like a traditional mechanical stent, but it's been equipped with sensors on the body of the stent that measure the electrical signals generated by surrounding tissue, such as the brain. And so by entering the jugular vein and routing a catheter up to what's called the superior sagittal sinus, and releasing the stentrode inside the vessel, we can now measure the electrical activity that is generated by the motor cortical neurons just outside the blood vessel. And so we've just finished enrollment with a study in the US of 6 people with severe paralysis. I'm just going to play this video now. This is one of our participants that has ALS. He's fully locked in, so he has no ability to communicate with family or caregivers. But using this BCI, which again was implanted through his jugular vein, he's able to fill out health questionnaires such as this pain survey in this example. So for someone with no ability to communicate otherwise, the BCI is a very liberating technology for them. Okay, so moving on. So I've shown a couple of examples of implanted devices, but one of the things we discovered a few years ago is that even people that have lost all ability to control their digits or generate movement in their hands, the muscles that control the hands still often retain some residual myoelectric activity. That is, we can still see electrical signals associated with that, with actions in those muscles, even if the muscles are too paralyzed to produce actual movement. And so that work, which we published a few years ago, caught the attention of some folks at Meta, because Meta is developing a wearable technology. It's intended for augmented and virtual reality applications, but they realized that it might also serve as a tool for expanding access to a broader class of digital devices for people with spinal cord injury. And so here, I'm just going to play this video. This is one of our participants wearing the Meta wristband. You can see the signals on this computer screen. Those little spiky things are the electrical signals that are generated in the participant's muscles when they attempt to move different digits in their hand. And by taking those signals and translating them into motion signals, the participants can control the cursor that is displayed on the screen. They can play video games by moving the characters up and down by simply thinking about moving their paralyzed hand. So there's a bit of a long video, but the participants all really like the gameplay part of these studies. Okay, so now the last thing I want to show is that in addition to kind of reconnecting the nervous system to devices, we're also keenly or deeply interested in using technology to boost spared function within the nervous system. And one of the approaches we use is something called spinal cord stimulation. This is a technology that's been in human use since the late 80s, so it's a very mature technology. It's fairly easy to implant because these are linear leads that can be implanted through a needle that is passed through the skin and into the spinal canal. And by electrically stimulating through these electrodes, we can activate intact parts of the nervous system to boost function that is damaged elsewhere. So for someone with a stroke where the signals coming from the brain are weaker than they need to be to produce movement, we can electrically stimulate other inputs to the motor neurons that are driving muscle function. And now I'll just play a video showing one of our participants performing what I think is the most important activity of daily living, which is eating. This is a woman that had a stroke 9 years prior to joining our study. She was implanted with a pair of electrodes in her neck that stimulate her spinal nerves. And here you can see her trying to use a fork to grab a piece of food on a plate. You can see because of the weakness in her hand, she has difficulty holding the fork securely. It slips through her grasp, and she has to rely heavily on her right arm, which is her good arm, to do the task. And then as well, even when she gets a hold of the fork and the food, because her elbow and forearm are too weak, she can't orient the fork in a way needed to actually take a bite. So now we're going to turn on stimulation. This is moments later. You'll see that her hand function is improved at least a little bit, enough to enable her to hold the fork firmly enough to grab the food. And now because her forearm and elbow are much stronger, she can bring the food all the way to her mouth. And so This is work that we're working to commercialize because, as I said, the hardware, the components of this system are fairly mature. It's really deepening our knowledge of how to control the stimulation in such a way to maximize benefit for the patients. And that's really the focus of our work at the moment. So now I'll just summarize very quickly. There's really a wide variety of technologies designed to connect directly to different parts of the nervous system to support a range of medical and perhaps eventually non-medical applications. And so some things that we often think about and we can maybe discuss as a group towards the end of our meeting today is, what is the appropriate balance of risk and benefit needed to justify use of technology like this? How do we ensure that access is available to all and not just those with privilege? And then as well, the usual privacy and agency issues, which are obviously so very critical. And with that, I'll stop sharing and...
Yeah. Thank you very much. And please hold your thoughts or write your questions. We will also have some questions for Professor Weber. I think this was very demonstrative of what are the uses and the medical applications. There's more to the story, and I hand over to Virginia to see what the markets and the consumer side of the products, where we are with that.
Absolutely. Let me just get my slides going as well. Hopefully I won't run into the same permissions issue. Can you see my my slides? You'll have to speak because I can no longer see the window. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yes, you can.
We see perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much to Doug for your introduction. Also, of course, thank you to Considerati for hosting this. Indeed, so just to quickly say, the Center for Future Generations, we're a policy think tank in Brussels focused on emerging technologies that could potentially have both huge benefits, but also disruptive potential for society, and informing policymaking to make sure that we get the most out of these technologies. So my work has been on neurotech. We've especially been focused on understanding the consumer neurotech market. The medical market holds really huge promise. It's also much longer established, but the consumer neurotech market is much more recent and it's much more quickly changing. So we think it's worth having a closer look at what that means and what the developments are. And I'll talk a bit about the ethics. So yeah, just to quickly say, I'll talk a bit about our analysis of the consumer neurotech market, what's happening, how it's evolving. I'll talk a bit about the ethical implications and human rights challenges potentially of both medical and non-medical neurotech. And I will briefly touch on neurotech governance, but I'll leave this mostly for the next speaker, Susanna, who will go in more detail. And if you do want to interrupt me, I can't see anything, so please do at any point. Okay, so yeah, Doug very well set the scene. Indeed, we have a very promising class of medical neurotechnologies, including the implants that were just demonstrated. There's also different types of stimulation, both implanted in the deep brain for disorders like Parkinson's, for instance, as well as external sensors. Doug mentioned myoelectric sensors in the peripheral nervous system, but also for the brain itself, we have EEG, as well as magnetic stimulation, for instance, which are all in various phases of clinical trials and being used. EEG, for instance, has been used already for almost 100 years, so it's very well characterized by scientists. And actually, what that's actually led to is, especially recently, a number of developments, including miniaturization of sensors, but also improved signal processing, AI, and especially dry electrodes, so electrodes that don't need gel to make contact with the skin. This has led to a whole new wave of devices that are outside the medical sphere, but that also record or stimulate, but mostly record some aspect of the nervous system, mostly the brain, and mostly using EEG. So you see these headbands, and it's also becoming more prominent into headphones, earbuds, and it has applications in VR and gaming and all that kind of stuff. Just to break it down a bit, so I sometimes go to conferences and demonstrate a couple of these devices. I have one here. This is the Muse headband, which is an EEG sensor band, so it measures the electrical activity of the brain. Nowhere near as precisely as a medical device, nothing like an implanted device, but it can get a general sense of how focused you are, if you're in a meditative state, or if you're asleep. So kind of big picture state of the mind. And the purpose of this device, for instance, the Muse, is to help improve meditation practice or to help improve sleep. And that works through an app that gives you feedback on your mental state. Similarly, we can talk about the Mendi device, for instance, which just measures blood flow, just like a pulse oximeter, to the front part of the brain, which helps you train attention and helps you train focus, a bit like a muscle. Again, a very gross and general measure, nothing like you would in a clinic, but it does seem to work. And we can also talk about stimulators. Now, we'll talk about regulation in a bit, but in Europe, we cannot stimulate the brain without being considered a medical device. But we do have other devices on the market, such as optical stimulators, which flash light in front of your eyes. And these produce a sort of a sense of relaxation and actually some mild psychoactive effects. And also we have a peripheral nervous system like the Pulsetto, which stimulates the vagus nerve and creates, again, a feeling of rest and digest, relaxation through activating that parasympathetic nervous system. So these are all not marketed for medical purposes, but they use very similar technologies to medical devices. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec. Just to say as well that at the most cutting edge of these consumer devices, they're becoming increasingly portable and increasingly more embedded into everyday devices. So we have the Neurable headphones, which are making a big splash at the moment. They have these dry cups that detect EEG through the skull to help you track your productivity while you're working. That's the main use. Here in Europe, we also have the Eden in-ear EEG earbuds that have just come out. Emotive has got these really interesting looking, this little patch on the forehead, the extrodes, and there's also the Mudra band, which is actually also peripheral to help engage with a computer, for instance. And these have a mix of consumer and research applications that they're being marketed for. It's also important to note that indeed big tech has taken interest. Doug mentioned Meta, who are interested in peripheral control of devices. Meta are also working on glasses. They are also working, actually on the next slide, I'll show you even another one as well. But Apple is also interested. They've got a patent for EEG in their AirPods. We also think we've spotted a partnership to bring EEG into the Apple Vision Pro. And also to mention, Synchron, that we just heard mentioned, is also working with NVIDIA, who are partnering to bring their AI into that device to improve the signal processing. And Apple is also working with Synchron actually to bring native control of their devices to the Apple interface. Bearing in mind these two ones at the bottom, the headlines, this is for medical applications, so that's not consumer just yet, but it is just to illustrate the point that big tech is taking an interest. So in our work, we've sort of spliced neurotech actually not into just two, but actually three different categories of use cases. There's the medical ones that we've discussed, which are really about treating a disease or restoring some kind of function, relieving pain, diagnosis. They've gone through clinical trials, that very clear category, strictly regulated. Then there's the fully consumer market, which is about productivity, focus, gaming, and maybe mindfulness meditation. And we actually have a big category in the middle that we call borderline devices. These are not classed as medical devices, but they do have some kind of, shall we say, a health benefit without being strictly treating a condition. And so we see a lot of devices promising to help relieve anxiety, to prevent burnout, to manage stress, improve sleep, and general brain health through, again, different methods such as either helping with meditation or just general insights on the brain activity. And this has also a big, they're marketed in these different ways. So I just want to highlight then, again, with an implanted device, you have much, much better signal resolution. And once you're outside the brain, things get much fuzzier. But it is really interesting to look at just what can you actually tell using one of these external devices. And what I've been doing is that using this Muse at conferences, these recordings were actually taken in my office. You can actually use a third-party app to extract the raw EEG data whilst someone is doing anything. And actually, I've been playing around with this data and seeing what can I take from it, just with an app and my laptop. This is just an example to show you a couple of recordings. These were taken about 10 minutes apart in our office with two of my colleagues who were willing volunteers. And the colleague on the left is a regular meditator, was able to get into a flow state. And you can very clearly see the blue line that shows alpha activity is much, much higher during this 1 minute of recording. And that indicates that he was in this relaxed state, in this sort of very calm mental state during this recording. And just by eye, you can see the person on the right, who is, by self-admission, a much more anxious person, and was really not able to calm their mind during this minute of recording, had all sorts of thoughts flitting around. You can see that the alpha waves are way down, and instead we have this green line, which is the beta waves, which are indeed associated with more like active thinking. So that just goes to show, like, again, we can't, we couldn't really dig much deeper into this kind of data as it is, but we can definitely see very clearly some overall brain states using this data. Then, of course, so what I've been playing around with is seeing, can we see changes in real time? So actually, this is the full image from the first person. So they were relaxed and meditating in the first part of this recording. And then actually about a minute in, where the red part starts, I leaned in and I told them, okay, imagine that you just stubbed your toe, and imagine it's really painful. And so then he started thinking really hard about that. The alpha waves drop suddenly, and the gamma and the beta waves come up. And you can see that now the mental state looks very different. He's in this much more focused and intensely thinking sort of state. Okay. So then the question is, okay, that's all well and good, but I mean, what can you really do with this? Especially by eye, we don't have the tools to analyze this kind of data. Well, actually, now we all do in our pockets, because as it turns out, ChatGPT is able to take these graphs and is able to very, very easily analyze them and extract meaning from them without any need for, a lab or any kind of coding skill. So for instance, I can feed it a graph and ask it, like, hey, what do you think happened at this time? And you can see on my screen here how, by eye, I would never be able to say what changed in this data. But ChatGPT is able to pick up that there was a shift in attention at this time, and to correlate it to something like, oh, there was probably a change in the environment or some kind of engaging effort that was undertaken at this point. And I also just want to point out, after a few trials, I also thought, well, is it able to tell not just, that something changed, but is it able to extract any kind of like characteristic? Like, was this a good thing or a bad thing? Was the person thinking about something positive or negative? It gave me a lot of caveats, but it was actually able to at least make a guess. In this case, it was correct, and this is my own brain data, that at the time that I mentioned that in the recording, I started thinking about something very, very positive, a happy memory. So this is just to illustrate, to start thinking a little bit about, okay, it's noisy data. Is it as powerful as a medical grade data? Maybe not. But even with just the sort of easy tools that we have and the access to these AI models that we have now, you can extract potentially some pretty powerful insights from this kind of data very easily. The bar to entry is much lower than it used to be. So just to start thinking about what that might mean. And in the meantime, I'll just spotlight a couple of maybe more emerging sort of consumer use cases. So NeuroChat is a preprint study from MIT from just a couple months ago. They actually hooked up this same device to ChatGPT whilst the user was doing a learning exercise. And they actually showed that they were able to have the algorithm adapt the content that was being given to the person based on their mental state. And this is called neuroadaptive computing. And there's actually a whole company, Xander Labs, that is working on exactly this premise as well. So it's adapting your computing environment in real time based on how your brain is responding to that computing environment. It's a really interesting premise. We have a couple of other examples. NeuroID is a company we're using, actually, again, same device to do neurobiometric authentication. So the idea is you can do away with all the passwords you've ever had to remember, and actually your brain can just authenticate for you. PIN codes, that sort of thing. And this is different. This is, again, not consumer, but Meta, one of the really interesting ones is that Meta has actually used, I think this is MEG that they used, but a much, much bigger version to actually decode thought into textual language, again, combined with AI. So potentially, eventually, you can actually just think something and then have it appear on the screen. But you know, this current technology for this is the size of a closet, so not exactly portable. Okay, just quickly talking about the market. So this is, I have to give full credit to my colleague Laura, who's on the call as well, for this study that we're just about to publish. So this is the nearly final data. Just to quickly say that we've been looking at the founding timelines and the data of the consumer versus the medical market. And we've found that the consumer market has really accelerated in the last 10 years. Both have, but the consumer one especially. There are now quite a few more consumer companies operating on the market than there are medical companies as of the last 10 years or so. And the markets are also completely different in terms of the technologies that they use. So in medical, neurotech is much more diverse. You have implants, stimulation, you know, artificial intelligence, EEG, everything. The consumer market is much more focused on this EEG, which I mentioned, which is this electrical activity. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I won't go into too much detail on that. It's also a neurotech market that is unsurprisingly kind of clustered in North America. But having said that, actually, Europe also has quite a few companies as well. Actually, only just slightly fewer if you take Europe together than the US. But across the globe, there are more consumer companies in each region than medical companies by a little bit. Also to say that, yes, especially what's interesting here is if we look at the specialization, North America, the types of companies that they tend to, that in the consumer space, tend to be more oriented towards wellness and fitness, like I said, meditation, mindfulness, and productivity. In Europe, the consumer companies tend to be more towards research and development tools, so tools to, you know, that people use in clinical trials. Rather than the medical devices themselves, although they do that as well. But it's interesting to note that kind of divergence in specialization. Okay, then I'm going to, I don't want to take up too much time. I hope I'm okay for time, but I'll just kind of take a tour of some of the ethical considerations. Obviously, you know, we've clearly seen that these technologies have some really promising benefits, and both in the medical and consumer market as well. But we need to also be aware of potentially some of the challenges and some of the questions that they raise that we need to be aware of. And so this is work that we undertook last year with the Institute of Neuroethics to kind of map those ethical issues. I'll actually skip this. But basically, how we kind of broke it down is that there are ethical issues to be aware of associated in different aspects. So first off, how the technology works itself, how it impacts people, and also to do with the specific uses and misuses potentially of neurotech. And then there are also some ethical legal issues that are kind of difficult to solve. So on the how it works, I mean, obviously, and Doug mentioned the safety is number one. Because especially for implanted devices, they can potentially have adverse health effects. There can be complications. We're also not entirely sure in some cases of the long-term health impacts. There's also difficulties associated with transparency. So especially when it comes to users with locked-in syndrome who have difficulties to communicate. How do you ensure user awareness of what's going on and that they have agency over the data? But this is also true with consumer devices. How are people really sure about where their brain data is going, how it's being collected, and what it's being used for? That leads, of course, to privacy. How can we be sure that people are consenting to data or either being recorded or their brains being influenced, really knowing fully what's going on? There's also inferences that can be made about the individual that they may not be aware of by sharing their brain data. For instance, that they might be at risk of a disease, a neurocognitive disease, for instance, like Alzheimer's, and they may or may not want to know that, and they may or may not want the person collecting data about them to know that. That's difficult to gauge on the individual. There's also issues of bias. A lot of these devices rely on AI these days, and we know that there are issues sometimes with bias and to do with the training of that AI algorithm, especially if the training was done with a certain subset of individuals, and the device is being used by a different subset. Then we're not, it's hard to say what is normal brain function if we're only training it on a certain subset of individuals. There's also issues to do with discrimination. So for instance, neurodiversity, like I mentioned, brains come in all shapes and sizes. There's the potential for this technology to be used to monitor the workplace, and that's already happening in certain places. In a high-risk situation, that might be, quite desirable, where people, you don't want a pilot falling asleep at the control, I guess. But in other situations, like factory floor workers, it becomes a bit more of a gray area. And then in an office, if you wanted to monitor workers' productivity in an office, some people might not like that so much. So there's a kind of a line to be drawn there somewhere. There's questions of, again, if you can predict, influence, or manipulate the behavior of someone based on either the data that's being collected, the insights that's being fed back to them, or the stimulation itself. How do people really retain control over themselves if their brain itself, which is initiating that control, is changed in some way? It's a kind of a funny loop, a thought loop there. Absolutely, the question of access, which Doug mentioned, the affordability is a big issue, and the geographic distribution. But also there's major differences in cultural perception around how people view these technologies and whether they want to use them. I think I'll move on, but of course, yeah, trust. How do we ensure that we're empowering people rather than creating a dependence for them, especially, let's say, if the manufacturer goes out of business of the device. And unfortunately, there are examples of that having happened, especially if it's an implanted device. That can be really problematic for the people left behind. And an identity, exactly. So, the brain is the seat of the identity. If that's being changed in some way, that can have serious impacts. Finally, just to say that there are also potential misuses of neurotechnology. It is a technology with dual use potential. It could potentially be used in interrogation, to torture, and it can be weaponized. That's obviously a big area of concern. But also it can be used in more subtle ways, potentially to profile or to target specific individuals of the population based on neurocognitive characteristics. And it can also create issues of, manipulation at the worst, influencing the public. These are kind of a little bit extreme, but the potential is there in the long run, shall we say, especially if these technologies become more mainstream. And then also, of course, there's especially when it comes to consumer devices, the concern that these devices don't go through clinical trials. If they're misleading their users into thinking they're delivering some kind of health benefit when actually they're not really validated, or there's no oversight of this market, that's potentially problematic as well. Okay, I think I'll leave this part because we'll get into the regulation part in a second. But just to quickly say that there's a big debate out there. There has been a big debate around the question of, do we need new human rights to protect the brain? And just to take the example of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, this is an extract of some of the relevant articles, but especially the right to mental integrity, protection of personal data, freedom of thought. It's been a big debate as to whether these are sufficient to protect the brain and the brain data from these potential ethical issues I mentioned. Sorry about the siren. But actually, this debate, I think we can largely consider it settled now. There have been dozens of academic publications on the topic. Experts have really dug into it. And for the most part, they now agree that our existing human rights frameworks as they are probably sufficient to protect our rights and the values we care about. But there is a consensus that our legislative frameworks are not yet fully there to really make sure that these technologies are safe and that they are delivering on their promises without putting people at risk. So that is still something to be discussed. Last point, but I think I've already gone on too long, so I'll just to very quickly say that we are working, we have developed a literal mind map of neurotech policy, sort of kind of around the world, but focused on Europe. We've looked at the different frameworks that have popped up that are specific to neurotechnology, for instance, at UNESCO, at the OECD, but also our human rights charters across different European countries and other countries that have enacted specific pieces of legislation already towards neurotech. That's all on the left side of the map. And on the right side, we've done a deep dive into all the European regulatory frameworks to understand how is neurotech currently regulated in the European Union. And just to say that there is no neurotech law out there, and brain data is actually very hardly mentioned anywhere in regulation. So it's a little bit hard to really understand what is and isn't legal when it comes to brain data particularly. But there are a lot of pieces out there already, and there are already a very high degree of protection in some ways. It's a little bit of a question of interpretation and stress testing it all together and making sure that especially new use cases that are coming on fit within this framework very clearly. And there are some gaps in there still. So I think I'll leave that there and pass on to the last speaker, Susanna. Thanks.
Yes, over to you, Susanna. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I open my micro. So that's really a moving landscape and extremely changing from one extreme to another. We listen. So I do not have slide. So my idea is to comment and to concentrate a little bit on the regulatory framework that are currently available and how this can be considered to discuss these matters. So starting from what Professor Weber presented, neuroimplant, so implanted device, this is a perfectly regulated domain. Highly regulated, so you need a lot of work in order to start your trial, your clinical trial with patients. You need to follow up what happens, the risk over time. You are obliged to provide vigilance about the application once this application is on the market. So it's a highly regulated situation. And we are satisfied both sides of the pond. So both in the US and the EU, this is tightly regulated. There is not so much to add. Similarly, especially, but perhaps I should add that in the EU is relatively recent because it's the last regulation about medical device that make the same level with FDA, and so we are happy now. We were not happy 10 years ago, but now we are completely happy. And any medical device is considered from its risk. So obviously an implant, a brain implant, has a high risk, so it's justified when the benefit for the patient is clear, like the fact that he can restore a function like movement, precise movement, like speech. So this is straightforward from a regulatory point of view, provided it's correctly applied. Now we go to the consumer grade device that are a little bit on the stage. This is a very interesting progress that has been done in the last decade. So take the example. I would like to discuss two examples. The EEG headband, that because it's really a powerful tool, and one that is less clear, that is games, strategy games on the mobile phones that are really interesting because it's a low profile neurotechnology, if you want. It's not even a neurotechnology, but it can have similar consequences. So let's focus on the headband EEG recorder. Actually, we have to remember that you can use consumer-grade devices in clinical trial, provided that you have described the use you will do in the clinical trial, the kind of data you will collect, how this data will be used to demonstrate what, etc. So, first things that it's not always clear. Consumer grade device can be used in clinical trial, but they cannot be used as medical device as such alone outside the clinical trial. Why? Because if you use a consumer device to do a diagnosis, or to do a therapy, a treatment, then you become a medical device. If you're a medical device, you have to demonstrate the safety, the effectiveness ahead of the other technical requirement. So, what I want to say, that consumer degree devices are really excellent example of neurotechnology, extremely powerful. The headband EEG recorder have been used in several situations, and please, Professor Weber, intervene if you think. They have also been used as brain computer interfaces, because you can try to decode activity in the surface without any invasive maneuver, and we can move something on a screen. You can decide the things. You can even speech, if I'm not wrong. So there is an interesting non-invasive tool, a very promising tool, as an example. Okay, so what can be done with this tool? When you buy, it is relatively easy to buy wherever you are. It's not so expensive. It's $500, $1,000. I have just look at. Even you can have much cheaper things. Okay, and what is promised? It is promised. Okay, you may gain in your control. You may you may distress. You may have much more productivity. So these are wellness claims, are not medical claims. This is very clear from a regulatory point of view. If you do a medical claims, you say, okay, this magnetic device can protect me from developing a dementia. This is a medical claim. So you need a standard development. You have to do clinical trials. You have to demonstrate that this is true, that the risk is less important than the expected benefit, and so on. If you say, oh, this helps you to concentrate, to be more productive, this is not a medical claim. So we are in this side, as Virginia described very well, between the real consumer and the borderline area. And this is, so this is a fact. Now we are in the borderline area with a lot of consumer degree devices. Now, where is the problem? Where is the gray area, and where is the potential problem? The potential problem is in the use of this data. So the use and potential misuse easy misuse of this data. If you look at the EU legislative frame, these data are health related first because describe your physiological status, describe your biometric behavior, your way to interact with reality, so they can identify biologically you, like genes, like other things in a way, especially if you keep this data somewhere and you use in the future. So are extremely powerful, this data. Now, this data, if you were in a situation of a clinical trial, they have to be de-identified, they have to be processed, they have to be treated, provided to agency that say the word on this. You are not in the medical device area, so you are in the consumer area. So this data, first, they are not de-identified. They are or identified or easily identifiable. So normally, in my interpretation, they should be regulated already by the GDPR. Why? Because GDPR regulates all identified or identifiable data, including health-related data. So this is an important point to me, that it's not true that there is no applicable legislative frame. There is a frame, then it's easy to be applied. It's not easy, can be ignored, can be used in a way in the EU and can be, let's say, not applied outside the EU because there is a different legislation. But this will apply in my interpretation. Now, what is the gray area? When you use a strategy game on your mobile to lose a little bit of time, you are traveling, you are on the plane, whatsoever. Then you use this game several times, 6 months ago, today, I will use in 6 months. Well, this game can potentially detect cognitive changes because it can provide a timeline of my cognitive performance. So in theory is equivalent to a cognitive test, okay? So potentially you can track the health, my brain health, through a mobile game, and you can do even better with a headband, an EEG recording headband. If you apply a chat GPT and read, Virginia has shown how we are functioning at the office, no? The more relaxed style, the one is really concentrated. So you can really intrude in the life and the brain of the person. And this is not so much regulated. Why? Because the general public is not aware of the potentiality in the use of this data. So it's true that formally, face value, the GDPR is applied, because if you go to the little icon with the setting, you can select you can tick opt out some data sharing. When you use this kind of games, you have, for example, data that data sharing with legitimate interest vendors. Usually they explain that this is for commercial purpose, that yes, you are profiled, but if you agree, you can be profiled, and so you will get even better proposal in your ads to have a more performant games and so on. So when you tick or you do not tick on the different question, if you take care to open the web page describing, like an informed consent, what could be done with your data, you can choose, you can opt out a number of cookies. You can opt out, but the general public doesn't opt out at all. Okay, one people out of 20 opt out. Okay, because I don't care. My data are used. Well, I don't care. However, this data can represent a huge amount of sensitive data that not identified. So this data can be potentially the matter for secondary research. Or secondary research is highly regulated. So this is the gray matter because you collect data. This data leave the EU territory, go away. Okay, because the application communicates and they ask, oh, okay, your data can be shared with other vendors. Vendors are based in the States or in Asia or wherever. So they have this huge amount of what they call big data at the beginning, and now is more nuanced. This data can be certainly used for secondary research, and the general public is unaware of this potential use. And so even if GDPR potentially protects us completely for a misuse, let's say it's not, perhaps it's not applied all the time. So this is an important piece of my reflection about the danger of these new opportunities that are really interesting because will be perhaps another point, will be perhaps a problem to apply another specific legislation. You see, we have a number of legislation in the EU and they do not have in the US. So where is the major development of neurotechnology? In the US or in Asia, they do whatever they want. And so we have a sort of break sometime if you discuss with professional, with people from the tech company that are happy, but not so much. And so the point is the interest of the tech company, the interest of the consumers, consider that fundamentally unaware of the diamonds that they give up for nothing. And so let's say what we can ask, more clarity in the application of the existing legislation in the consumer area. Yes, but it's easy to do, and many companies are doing the exercise to improve the web page description, how your data will be used, are you happy, etc. So if you open the page, obviously, you don't open the page. Now the point then is this risk, once you didn't opt out, that this huge quantity of data are misused in is a very near future by third parties that bought the data by the company who collected the data. So this is, for me, is the real issue. It's not to protect, so Virginia, I little bit go in a slightly different discussion. I think that the ethics of this is already protected in a number of ways. The point is really about how to avoid the misuse because there can be holes in the application of the legislative frame. So we have clinical trials. You can do anything. You spent 1 year to get the approval of the clinical trials. Consumer grade device, you can do everything. So this is the point, and so this is a matter of application or reflection. Perhaps there could be the reason not to introduce new legislation, who knows? But it's not essential. We have to start from awareness of users that can be unaware of the power of some device like the EEG external recording. It's extremely powerful. You can move a machine outside your house with an EEG recorder on your head. So potentially you can do it. You can do it. So my point is, what if I'm the consumer? What I would like to have? I would like to be certain that my digital twin does not exist and without me be aware of this existence, because the density of data you can reconstruct, rebuild together is enough to theoretically build my brain digital twin. And as a consumer, I want to know that there is a digital twin, a brain digital twin somewhere, that how it's used is used to benefit some population, some subpopulation, some specific subgroup of the population. So I think awareness of the consumer is a key point for me, and the good application of existing legislative frame that is very rich. Now you will have also the application of the Cybersecurity Act. We have the AI Act. So we have a number of protection, and so I'm not sure that we have to imagine another legislative tool.
Thank you, Susanna. Perhaps some simplification, which is underway, but in the sense of supporting innovation, can also benefit clarity and fine tuning. But over to Cornelia, who had some interesting questions, and we want to allow a bit of time also for the audience.
Yes, and please start raising your hands if you have questions. When listening to all three speakers, there's actually two questions that I think any of you might be able to respond to. The first was I was thinking more towards Professor Weber in the context of your cooperation with industry players and this slight tension of the objectives that industry players have versus people that are dedicated to medical health, versus those that are dedicated to their shareholder value. So this is one sort of, I think, tension in how you cope with that. And then maybe a second question, just from a technical perspective, that goes back a little bit to Virginia and Susanna as well, is in those devices, there is a lot of inferred data, I would assume, that you can read from the brain activity. I think, Virginia, with your own data, you sort of had ChatGPT make some of these assumptions, but inferred data per se is not necessarily protected by GDPR. And I think that might actually be a gap here. So I'd love you to react to both of these areas if possible.
Why don't we start with the second question for Virginia?
Oh, sure. I was actually going to pull something up, but yes, I'm happy to talk about that if you want, unless you want to go.
I mean, I guess I could just say something briefly about the first point. So the only company that we're working with that doesn't operate in the medical device space is Meta. And they they have no interest in pursuing and no plans to pursue the medical domain. Instead, what they see is that this consumer grade device that they're developing, like many of our existing digital devices, could add features to enhance access for people with sensory, or in this case, motor impairments, right? And so that was really their motivation. Could this, like some of the other tools, be used to make it to make digital devices and digital experiences more accessible to a broader group of users. They don't receive any of the data. We don't share any raw data with them. We obviously show them results and videos and demonstrations, but they have zero access to the participant data that we're gathering. there are other companies working in this space. I assume they operate along similar guidelines, but I don't have direct experience.
Thank you. Virginia.
Yeah, just to quickly come up on that question of inferred data. So to my understanding, legally, it is still considered personal data as if it's linked to the same sort of category of biometric or health-related data. But it is true that it's not explicitly mentioned. And there is definitely some wiggly, like where do you draw the line exactly? At what point is it identifiable to the person? At what point is it aggregated per groups? An example of one app that I saw, for instance, was meant for the workplace, and they were gathering data from employees, and then they were sharing that with the employer, but they were aggregating it and only the inferences, not the raw data. And that's like, okay, okay, but the employee didn't have control over that. It was sent to the employer, but that was like, this was in the US, so the legislation is different there. And as you said, it's a lot more lenient. But in the EU, in theory, yes, but this is exactly an example of one of those things that we said, because we have these really excellent tools, as Susanna did say, the GDPR, but because it's not explicitly clear how brain data is treated and how the inferences from brain data are treated under these frameworks, there's potentially some wiggle room that companies might try to exploit, let's say, if they don't have the best of intentions, unfortunately. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we're kind of exploring. And yeah, so thanks for the question. I also just wanted to, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just on the first point, actually, about competing interests in industry as well. This is also a really interesting one. We actually did a sort of an in-depth analysis on this as well with Laura. And indeed, there's in the medical field, the incentives are fairly clear, but the barriers are much higher. In the consumer field, the incentives are, well, the potential for a quick return on investment is much, much higher, but the incentive to the health incentive is not the same. It's much more about monetizing, right? So what we've heard is people say, well, we want to develop our device outside medical frameworks so that we can democratize access to brain health for everyone. In other words, so that you can sell your device to a lot more people. It's a great concept, absolutely. Let's make brain health more accessible. But on the other hand, that also means, well, okay, yeah, it's easy for you to monetize it. I'm here at CPDP today, the privacy conference, and it's the same thing across all digital apps. It's all about getting the most users possible because your tech is great, but also so you can make more money. So, yeah.
Yeah, Jakob Hensing from the Global Public Policy Institute, you had a question.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. My question is to Susanna. I work at the Global Public Policy Institute on a project that looks at how advances in neurotech will matter for foreign and security policy. So I've heard this argument about kind of basically brain data being protected by GDPR, but because it is kind of already considered personal data before. And I think that's an important point. Like the one thing that I don't fully understand as a non-lawyer is, in my understanding, that interpretation hinges on the question of identifiability and personal attributability, right? But I mean, yes, I kind of take the point that if you kind of have the brain data in a particular format and particular degree of granularity, and you have a comprehensive database of everybody's brain data, then kind of on that basis, you would be able to identify a person that this comes from on the basis of for instance, one recording that you have. But I mean, is there sort of kind of case examples where this question of at what point becomes data that you can only attribute if you also have access to a very comprehensive database, is that something where we have cases to draw on, or what's the usual approach to that? I mean, I could think of a fingerprint as an equivalent, but that's something that I haven't sort of fully sorted out for myself. Thank you.
So I don't know if I captured completely the question. So yes, you may theoretically create a sort of a finger. You can identify a person by the neuronal behavior, at least in theory. Professor Weber, come to me if I'm saying something too much in the future, but there are studies to re-identify, yes, this is the person because this person reacts like this, this is the pattern. So there is a stream to use data in this way. In that case, we are in the GDPR remits, for sure. Okay, that's no doubt. Yes, you need a granularity. So perhaps you cannot find on the dark web all the data, or you cannot buy from a provider this granularity of data. But you may create the identity of a brain way to work in a at least in theory. So this is an issue. This is a thread. Okay, using this, you can re-identify like for forensic identification by the work you have done in your teeth. It's very similar. Obviously, what is different? That your brain behavior changes over time. So it can be substantially different 30 years apart. So it's not exactly, but also the finger can evolve with aging and are not exactly the same 30 years apart. Okay, but I mean, is a potential use or misuse the identification through the granular description of a brain behavior. So the thread is there. See if this is the question.
I mean, perhaps if I can briefly clarify, my point is that you can only identify somebody by their brain data if you either already have their brain data, and that's a sense you might be able to confirm that it indeed comes from that person, or if you have a very large data set and a very powerful analytical tool by which you can identify a person from that data set as being the origin of this particular brain data. But I mean, the brain data itself doesn't really allow you to identify any random person if you don't have that recording previously. That was my point.
Yeah, I agree with you. You cannot identify only by the analysis of the signals. Yeah, you can't. If you do not have other hints. And the point is that usually you have other hints very easily because you can find the tracking in telecommunications. So, well, we do not know how the third parties process the data. That's the point. Usually, this kind of data are used to learn AI application, AI
To train.
new let's say application, new tools, new device, AI-based device. So this is the point. You have all this behavior, brain behaviors, a collection of brain behaviors. You teach your system, and then the system, if the data were sufficient informative on a population, can try to understand something or apply to a similar population. So it's a completely different things. A forensic use and a use about knowing more about brain functioning, with the risk, in this case is the risk to re-identify an individual that wasn't aware, to have given away his data.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. There are a lot of implications.
If I may conclude a little bit, we can still have one more question if somebody has a specific question. I want to conclude also on a positive note, not just on the next steps and the recommendations, which that's also necessary, I think. more clarity, for example. I wanted to ask, for example, Professor Weber, what's most exciting? Because science used to be something exciting and innovation is also something exciting. So let's think for the next years to come. We can say 10 years or next 5 years, something that you are expecting and we should watch out in this space that is linked to your nice profession.
So probably two different application spaces, and then maybe a more general comment that, when I started graduate school a while ago, this was in the mid 90s, it really seemed like science fiction, this concept of developing brain-computer interfaces that would someday help people with paralysis, connect with assistive devices. You know, I was working in using animal models at the time, and while it seemed promising, I didn't imagine we would make as rapid a progress as we did in the next 10, 15 years. And so I'm really excited that there's not just, all of these wonderful proofs of concept in humans, but there's actually industries committed to bringing those devices to market, because nature papers are great, but they don't really help people in general. So I'm excited about the industry growth. I'm excited that, because there is this industrial foundation, and that there are devices approved for human use, those are also being used in a more basic research setting as well. And so our ability to do discovery, not just in animals, but while we're helping people, we're also learning about how to make the devices better and extend the therapies in new directions. So, so I think science as well as medicine, are both advancing because of the push to do this work in humans. So those are kind of the two areas I'm most excited about.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe,
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe one last question, because we are, of course, here in a policy environment, maybe that is more, but really for the three. I mean, if you wanted something that, the European Commission, the legislators should be doing, what would be like your ask in this mandate?
Virginia.
I'll defer to Virginia.
We have a three-part strategy of what we think needs to be done in this mandate. Number one, prioritize ethical innovation for unmet medical needs, exactly the kind of thing that Doug is doing. Number two, make sure that our regulatory frameworks are clear and that they're cohesive. As I mentioned, it's super fragmented and unclear right now. That might mean making some changes. It might not, but it's going to be a huge effort to really look at that all together. And number three is public awareness and public engagement, is raising awareness in the public about the benefits and risks, and also making sure all the relevant stakeholder perspectives are involved in these conversations, including people with lived experience in particular, and also the industry themselves. So that's our 3-point strategy.
I love that strategy. What I will say is that in the U.S., I think something that has made a huge difference in at least the past 10 or 15 years that I've been working in this space, and particularly during my time at DARPA when I was leading national initiatives, is that our regulatory body, the Food and Drug Administration, for years was sort of this kind of walled off entity. They were a gatekeeper, and the research community was often a bit reluctant to engage the FDA openly for fear of saying the wrong thing and tricking or triggering suspicion. And instead, the FDA, whether it's policy changes that they made or just increased efforts to do outreach to engage the community, but by working more openly with the research community early on in the research process, not just at the end when there's this device that they want to get approval for, but having an open dialogue between the regulatory bodies and the researchers, so that way the researchers are better informed of the critical requirements as early as possible. and the regulatory bodies can learn as much as they can about what the devices are, how they work, what some of the challenges are, so that they too can be educated on what is coming down the pike. So again, I guess it's just, you know, an open collaborative relationship between those that regulate the technology and those that are developing the technology, I think is really critical. Susanna.
Thank you.
So what about the early dialogue with regulatory people, because I was at the EMA, and that was one of our target to get developer early in order to make together progress.
So the way we handled that at DARPA is we included scientists from the FDA in our program. So when we would have program review meetings where we'd bring all the investigators together, the regulatory people would be there and they'd be asking questions. They would be sort of seeing behind the scenes at everything that was going on. They were part of our review process. And so they educated us as managers of the research as well. They interacted directly with the people doing the research. So again, it was just, you know, more openness in general. But it does require, you know, commitment, right? That they had to commit the time, you know, to be present for those interactions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're also at the end of the session. This was super, super informative. From my end, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists, for all the speakers. Note all the references to the policy papers that are coming out of the respective organizations. I was also already looking at Professor Weber's website. There is a lot that you can get information from. Big thanks from my end, and then I will also hand over to Anna Maria, to Anna Maria herself, who has been bringing everybody together. So thanks for that as well, Anna Maria.
Thank you very much. For me, this is a topic that is gonna stay with me, and it's not the first discussion. And I hope we have the occasion to continue, because it's emerging technology. It's our health. It's awareness, education. So it was really exciting, and I thank all the participants and especially the great speakers for your motivation and for hanging on and all the good points. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you,
for organizing
everyone.
this.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.